Welcome back to episode 7 of Revolutionary Roads, a podcast of the North Carolina History Project here at the John Locke Foundation. I'm your host, Donald Bryson, and this is a podcast, if you've been listening, as you know, we are walking through the rich history of North Carolina in the American Revolution. And there's a lot of things that happen within our state and things that happen in surrounding states that affected our state, as we'll talk about today. For episode 7, we're going to talk about the backcountry of North Carolina. We've talked a good bit about the coast. Of course, the first episode was about the Battle of Alamance and the War of Regulation. But what happened in western North Carolina? There were people living there. They obviously were affected by the American Revolution. What happened in the backcountry, and what is this battle that if you've driven between North Carolina and South Carolina on I-85 very much, what was the Battle of Kings Mountain? As we walk through this history, we've had the War of Regulation that culminated in the Battle of Alamance in 1771. Then we had the Edenton Tea Party in late 1775. The Battle of Moores Creek that happened in early 1776, the Halifax Resolves, where North Carolina declares its independence in April of 1776, culminating in its first constitution that comes about with the 5th Provincial Congress in November of 1776. But then what happens between 1776 and 1780? Well, a lot of that action happens in the backcountry. And that's what we're talking about today with our guest. Our guest today is John Hood, former president of the John Locke Foundation, current board member of the John Locke Foundation, president of the John William Pope Foundation, also author of several books, including a series called Mountain Folk, which is a historical fantasy series. The first book actually deals with the American Revolution.
It does.
Right? So here we are. North Carolina has done a good bit, first state to declare independence, and the British have wanted to invade the southern states. We talked about this when we talked about the Battle of Moores Creek, that there were some loyalists. They were marching towards Wilmington, and they were stopped at Moores Creek, which is now and at that time was northwest of Wilmington, and that prevented an early invasion of the southern colonies. But then in late 1778, December 29th, 1778 to be specific, the British invade Savannah, Georgia, and hold Savannah against an attack later on that year. What happens, and where do we go from there?
Well, it's important to put this, if you think about the American Revolution as a series of phases, the first phase primarily centered on New England, where the British realize we really can't suppress these crazy New Englanders.
Right.
And they kind of give up on that fairly early in the war. Mm-hmm. Then they focus on the mid-Atlantic states primarily, thinking if they can take the major cities, take New York, take Philadelphia, the capital, right, perhaps cut off New England from the rest of the colonies, right, then they can win. And that really consumes a lot of the activity in 76 and 77 and early 1778. As you allude to, there was originally a southern strategy in 1776. Moores Creek Bridge kept the Loyalists from coming to the coast. The British did arrive. General Clinton and the Admiral Peter Parker, who always makes me kind of snicker.
Not Spider-Man.
Not the Spider-Man, but he did have great power. But he didn't do it very responsibly because they tried to take Charleston later in 1776 and failed. So for a couple of years, the focus was in the mid-Atlantic states, where the British enjoyed tremendous successes, but frustratingly, it didn't seem to matter very much. They took New York and held it. They took the capital, Philadelphia, right, and it didn't make the Americans stop fighting.
Right.
So then they had to reassess, well, what are we trying to accomplish? And they turned again their eyes to the southern colonies, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia.
Right.
Not only did they believe there to be many loyalists in these places that would rush to the king's banner, and there were some loyalists, but they exaggerated that. But they also did a cold-hearted calculation that the southern colonies were more valuable. It's where a lot of the export crops were grown, right, rice, indigo, cotton would come later, but tobacco, rice, indigo were important crops. The New England states were actually very similar economically to to Great Britain, and so it wasn't as important, they perceived at least, to their most important American colonies, which were none of the ones we're talking about.
Right.
It was the Caribbean, the sugar colonies.
Oh, that's right.
France comes into the war, partly because of the Battle of Saratoga going the Americans' way, and even the George Washington's defeat at Germantown outside of Philadelphia in 1777, although it was a defeat, it was an impressive defeat. He did a very complicated plan and it almost worked. These things reassured the French and they came in to the war on the side of the Americans. That changed everything for the British. They had to think not so much just about suppressing a few unruly Boston, mobsters, but what about our larger empire, the Canadian part of their empire, the Caribbean part of their empire? The South became a more important place. It was closer to their valuable holdings in the Caribbean. They felt like those two things could interact and defend each other better. And in fact, there were troops that were sent from the Caribbean to the Southern campaign and from the Southern campaign to the Caribbean, depending upon what the French were doing. So it's important to think about New England first, Mid-Atlantic states in the middle of the war, and then the last couple of years of the war, the focus becomes on the South. They start in Savannah in late 78. They take the city. They go up the river, Savannah River, and take Augusta, Georgia, briefly, but they couldn't really hold it.
Right.
The Americans and the French, by this time, had come into the war, as we recall. They attack Savannah almost a year later, trying to take it back. They fail. And that's when the British say, maybe it's time we look a little bit further up the coast and go after Charleston again.
That's right. And for our listeners, you'll notice that during the whole military history that we cover over this episode and the next episode in particular, the name George Washington is going to come up very little because he never actually came here. There were significant battles fought in North Carolina or on the North Carolina border and in South Carolina, but he never actually fought a battle here. After the British invaded, held for a little while, and then left Philadelphia, essentially they went back to New York, and Washington had New York under siege, a very loose siege, for about 3 years. Not a lot happened up there, and all of the attention turned down here.
There was an attempt to take Newport, Rhode Island, that failed. There were some various other battles here, there, and sort of up the Hudson River. But you're right, nothing of tremendous strategic consequence was happening in the Mid-Atlantic states, and certainly not in New England. The focus shifts to the Carolinas, and really to South Carolina at first in early 1780, when the British, this is again General Clinton, his second in command, Charles Cornwallis, is going to become the main commander. And they finally do encompass, besiege, and take Charleston. Charleston surrenders. They didn't even have a major battle there. Thousands of Americans were captured. It was really quite embarrassing. And from there, the British and their Hessian auxiliaries, their German auxiliaries, they leave the low country of South Carolina, head through the Midlands. There are some partisan activity. And this is where Cornwallis makes a huge mistake that has implications for both Carolinas. When they take the city, the Charleston port, they do what's called a parole. Now, we think about parole like law enforcement, like you serve a certain number of months and then you're paroled out of the prison. In the military context, parole was we take you prisoner, and if you promise not to take up arms again, we let you go home. So you're paroled, and if you violate parole, if you go and join the enemy army again, you're subject to execution. You violated your parole. They paroled a lot of the main Patriot commanders, including Thomas Sumter, including a number of the military commanders who went home. But then Cornwallis decided, this is too lenient, and he revoked parole and said, actually, never mind, unless all these prominent Carolinians take an oath of allegiance to the king, we're going to capture them again. We're going to take them again and treat them as traitors.
Sure.
Well, what do you think these guys did? This is kind of sort of depicted in the Mel Gibson movie, The Patriot, where this happened. But basically, this infuriated them, and what choice did they have but to go back into a partisan warfare?
If Cornwallis is going to go back on his word, we will go back on ours.
Absolutely. He actually set off these three, in South Carolina, these three nests of partisan activity, one in the low country, the coastal counties, the famous Swamp Fox Francis Marion was the primary commander there. In the center part of South Carolina, called the Midlands, this is where Thomas Sumter, the Carolina Gamecock, was the primary commander. And in the west, Andrew Pickens, not as much covered in some of the history movies and so forth, but he was important too. And then in North Carolina, around the Charlotte area, because remember, the Carolinas at this time, they're separate colonies. They used to be one. Right. But the border between North and South Carolina, especially as you go west, is very fuzzy. So William Richardson Davie is one of the main militia commanders in the Charlotte area. He had a number of North Carolina militia companies that he was sometimes sending into South Carolina to support some of these partisan activities. The partisans in South Carolina gave Cornwallis a lot of trouble. Sure. They won several smaller skirmishes. There was also a regular army in South Carolina, reconstituted after Charleston, reconstituted. Armies were sent, or troops were sent south from George Washington's army, and there were some other regulars. There was a regular army. It was commanded by Horatio Gates, who was
famous for winning the Battle of Saratoga.
Supposedly winning the Battle of Saratoga, though I think other people were more responsible for that. But in August of 1780, he is in command at a disastrous encounter with the British called Camden, the Battle of Camden, which was a decisive American defeat. Gates actually ran away to Charlotte before the battle was even really over. I have a number of ancestors in all these stories, but two of my ancestors were at Camden, and one of them was very seriously wounded. So this was a disaster, and basically the regulars were broken. They fled. Gates actually ended up running all the way to Hillsborough, North Carolina, which is where the governor of North Carolina, Abner Nash, and the governor of South Carolina, John Rutledge, were hanging out together because, of course, South Carolina was largely under the control of the British, or at least in theory. So Gates goes back there to rebuild his army, leaving the militia to figure out what to do. And so Gates is not part of any subsequent part of the story we're going to talk about today, because he's left. Much of the regulars have dissipated or retreated. But that left the militia, including militia from North Carolina, that played a significant role in resisting the British as they tried to secure their control over South Carolina. Some of them were even from over the mountains. So keep in mind, North Carolina at this point is a much longer state than today. It includes modern-day Tennessee. So in theory,
goes
at least,
all the way to the Mississippi.
In theory, I mean, not very many settlers had gone that far, but quite a few, several thousand, had gone over the mountains, over the tallest mountains, and actually lived in what is today northeast Tennessee and southwest Virginia. At the time was North Carolina and/or Virginia. Again, the border was a little unclear. There was a county that was kind of split.
Not a lot of surveys going on.
So there were some troops that actually, or militia that came over the mountains and helped in some of those South Carolina battles, and they got some important experience in militia fighting the British. And in particular, a guy named Isaac Shelby. Shelby was originally from Maryland, like a lot of Carolinians. He came down the wagon road with his family, ended up living in what is now Bristol, Tennessee, was called Shelby Station originally, because the Shelby family had founded a station there. Daniel Boone stopped there to get supplies on his way back and forth to Kentucky. So Isaac Shelby, another man named John Sevier, who lived nearby, of Huguenot stock. Sevier was Sevier in French, but Sevier on the. So Shelby in particular brought some men. They were all on horseback. They came down. They participated in some of those battles. They went back home. Well, Cornwallis at this point realizes, I can't fully subdue South Carolina, the really valuable source of rice and indigo and all that, until I do something about North Carolina. This is where the base of operations of the resistance is. I mean, Pickens and Sumter and the Swamp Fox, they're doing their thing, but unless they had supplies and help from North Carolina, they couldn't last very long. So he decides to invade North Carolina, but he realizes, there are these unruly people from the backcountry and even over the mountains that are causing me trouble, and I need some more heft to fight them. And so I need to get I've heard talk of all these loyalists. It's time for them to show up. Cornwallis, I'm kind of paraphrasing. This time to get the loyalists to support our army, Cornwallis thinks. And that's what leads us to maybe a broader discussion of the backcountry and who was on what side and why did he think there were lots of men to be mustered.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting conversation leading us up through South Carolina into North Carolina. And by the way, if your listeners are interested in hearing more of what's going on, please like, subscribe so you can get the next episode. Share with your friends if you like what we've produced and think you'll continue to like what we're producing here. We think we're putting together a really interesting podcast for a history that not a lot of people read about and hear about. But you mentioned these over mountain men in the mountains of North Carolina, over the mountains into Tennessee, which is what Tennessee means, or Tennessee means in Shalagi. But not all has been quiet in the mountains, right? We've talked about these very, very formal happenings with provincial congresses and, the Halifax Resolves and declarations of independence and the Mecklenburg Resolves and the Mecklenburg Declaration, which may or may not be real, and all of these things. And we've talked about formal armies invading towns and all that. But in 1776, things sort of break out and get a little nasty in the backcountry, particularly in the mountain area. What's going on, particularly with the Native American tribes back there?
Let's define our terms real quick.
Sure.
Backcountry we think of today perhaps as far western North Carolina, but at this time, what is now Raleigh, what is now Durham, was the backcountry.
Fair enough.
Orange County, which included what modern day Durham and part of Wake County, that was the backcountry. Hillsborough was the frontier town.
Yeah.
It's kind of an odd way to think about it. But if you go further west, you have a number of things happening. But regarding the Cherokees, there was an uprising in 1776. There were British agents coming up from Pensacola, from various British possessions, Mobile, Pensacola. They brought arms. They brought ideas of how to help. Remember, in that early Southern campaign by the British in 76, they had more than one part of the plan. Part of the plan was get those Highlanders and those other loyalists to come to Wilmington and meet up with the British. Well, we know that didn't happen. The other thought that some of them had, at least, was get the Indians to raid the frontier parts of North and South Carolina. The militia will have to go west to defend the frontier against the Indians. That will weaken their position. That'll make it easier for us to take a Wilmington or a Charleston and move in. Now, the timing of this never, they didn't have, internet or phones or even telegraph.
Fair enough.
So a lot of this timing didn't really line up very well. But there were British agents saying attack the Americans. Now, the Cherokees had a lot of beef with the over mountain settlers, the people who lived in modern-day Tennessee, northwestern Tennessee, northwestern Virginia. But the backcountry actually kind of stops at the mountains. So think about it, if you were going east to west, the coast, where most of the 60% of the population, North Carolina was in the coast at this time,
right.
40% of the backcountry. So you have the middle part of the backcountry goes from all the way from like today's Raleigh all the way to the foothills of the Appalachians, the Blue Ridge.
So Salem, Winston-Salem.
Yeah,
Salem.
it definitely includes Winston-Salem, Wilkes County, even the backcountry. The other side of the tallest mountains, the western side, we'll call that the Over Mountain area. The Cherokees actually wanted to attack the Over Mountain area. Those were the settlers that they thought were really encroaching unfairly
across
on
the treaty line.
Yeah, I mean, there's dispute about that, but we'll set that aside.
Sure,
That's who
enough.
they thought. They didn't think the people living in Rowan County or Wilkes County were their enemies.
Right.
But the British thought differently because those were mostly the Patriots. The Over Mountain people were kind of neutral. So the Cherokees were supposed to attack the Patriots in the backcountry. They did attack some of the Patriots in the backcountry, but they also attacked the Over Mountain people and turned them from more or less neutral to anti-British. So that was a mistake. And as we fast forward the conversation to 1780, a lot of those disputes are still there. Cherokees, the initial attacks fail in 76, but there's a faction,
Right.
sometimes calling themselves the Chickamauga Cherokee, led by Dragon Canoe and some other chiefs, who just kept attacking. And so when Cornwallis is going into North Carolina and has one of his officers, Patrick Ferguson, go into Western North Carolina to scare/recruit soldiers, I don't think he really counted on the Cherokees like collaborating and attacking in a contemporaneous way. But it probably wasn't entirely impossible. They sort of figured that there might be some reasons why the settlers out in the mountains might not come to the aid of their backcountry cousins. So Patrick Ferguson goes into the area. He does have an army. Now, his forces are not regulars. They're not British regulars. They are what are called provincials. In other words, they are regular troops,
Right.
but they're from New Jersey primarily. These are regular troops. They've been trained. They have British arms. They have muskets and bayonets and that sort of thing, but they're not British soldiers. They're American loyalists. And then they have loyalist militia. There were some loyalists that did come to the British banner, not as nearly as many as they expected. So Ferguson goes in, and I just so I'll make sure I get the wording right, he does two things that lead to the Battle of Kings Mountain directly. Right. One of them is he sends a message to Isaac Shelby specifically and to anybody that hangs out with Isaac Shelby. He's very angry because Shelby has actually defeated some British troops at Musgrove Mill.
And again, for our listeners, this is a great time in North Carolina history because you keep hearing names of places you can go, like Shelby.
You can go to Shelby, North Carolina. You can watch The Simpsons. What is the rival town to Springfield?
What
Shelbyville.
Is it Shelbyville?
It's named after Isaac Shelby. But anyway, Isaac Shelby's another relative of mine. He's my first cousin. So Shelby is in the mountains. Ferguson sends him a message that says, if you do not desist from your opposition to British arms, He will march his army over the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay their country waste with fire and sword. In other words, he threatened Shelby and the other over mountain people. You just stay out of this. All right, we're going to subdue the backcountry people, the people who live in what is today Winston-Salem and Lenoir and Burke County and places like that. We're going to subdue them, Charlotte, all those crazy people, those crazy Presbyterians. We're going to subdue them, and you stay out of it or we'll come get you too.
Yeah.
The second thing he does is he sends a message to loyalists in the region, says, come to our banner. But he doesn't do it in a stirring, positive, patriotic way. This is what he says to the loyalists in Western North Carolina. He says, essentially, people like Isaac Shelby and the revolutionaries, they're barbarians. And you don't want to hang out with them. In fact, if you don't want to be poisoned, robbed, murdered, see your wives and daughters abused by the dregs of mankind, in other words, if you don't want these patriots to rape your wives and daughters, you better come to our service. And he furthermore says, if you don't come to our service, if you choose to be, and I'm going to use the term that he used, even though it's a bit off color, okay? But if you choose to be pissed upon by a set of mongrels, say so at once and let your women turn their backs on you and look out for real men to protect them. So he was insulting the patriots. Don't you dare fight us again or we'll wipe you out. And he was even insulting the loyalists. Show up and fight with me, and if not, you're a bunch of weenies. And your women are going to hate you.
Wow.
Now, what do you think this does? It does exactly the opposite, I assume, of what Patrick Ferguson thought. First of all, it angers all these over mountain men and the backcountry men who might have been scared to fight Ferguson, but now are angry enough to come after him.
Right.
And it scared the loyalists.
Right. Yeah.
So he actually weakened his own recruiting of loyalists, and he egged on the patriots. Those two actions led inexorably to what happened, which is Kings Mountain, which happens in the fall of 1780.
So you mentioned Patrick Ferguson and generally what Patrick Ferguson's mission was. Let's level set where we are in our timeline of the American Revolution. So the colonies collectively declare independence in 1776. North Carolina sets up its first constitution in November of 1776. In 1776, generally speaking, is when we first start seeing sort of Indian raids in the mountains and somewhat out of the mountains, and Dragon Canoe, which we were talking about before our recording. Dragon Canoe, actually, spoiler alert for everybody, his attacks continue after the war, and he isn't actually, he ends up dying in battle in 1792, well after the end of this war, and actually after the establishment of what we now have of the United States Constitution. So that goes on for some time. So in May of 1780 is where we are now. Charleston falls. And then there's a battle in June of 1780 in what is now Lincoln County, North Carolina, called the Battle of Ramsier's Mill. Won't spend a lot of time on it. Not that it wasn't important, but we're going to cover a lot of ground on the Battle of Kings Mountain, in that there were a lot of loyalists collecting together in or around what is now Lincoln, North Carolina, and Patriots attacked them and drove them off, and it prevented basically Tories from organizing to join up with Cornwallis as he's about to enter into
in
North
fact,
Carolina.
this is kind of the predicate for what I was just telling you about regarding Patrick Ferguson, which happens a little after that. So the Battle of Ramsier's Mill occurs in Lincolnton, and the Loyalists are driven off, and this is pretty disheartening to the Loyalists. What Patrick Ferguson is trying to do, and this is happening in August and September of 1780, is he's trying to get them to come back. No, reconstitute, join my army. I'm the left wing. He's the left flank of Cornwallis's advancing army. He needs more men. He's trying to get them to join up. But his messages, which are basically to antagonize the Patriots, and to terrify or insult the Loyalists, they don't accomplish his objective. He starts to hear that the Patriots are convening. And Patrick Ferguson is a regular British Army officer. He is well trained. He's actually an inventor of a gun.
He invented the Ferguson, one of the early breech loading rifles.
Absolutely. He was brilliant in many ways, but he made some severe mistakes here, and so to speak. And so he hears that John Sevier and Isaac Shelby and others are convening just over the what is now the North Carolina-Tennessee border at Sycamore Shoals. This happens in late September of 1780. He does hear that this is occurring, or something like this is likely to occur. And he starts to reposition, think about, well, maybe I should go back towards the fort in South Carolina called 96, or maybe he should go to Charlotte and meet up with Cornwallis, but he's kind of exposed and he starts to pull back. He's also still trying to find nests of Patriots. He's still trying to recruit Tories, and he's not succeeding at either thing. The Sycamore Shoals event, there's hundreds and hundreds of soldiers that arrive there. Some of them are actually backcountry men who have fled Ferguson. So there are some people from what is now Morganton actually at this meeting in Sycamore Shoals.
Interesting.
They come over the mountain.
Long way.
It's a very long way. But a lot of these people were cousins. They were related. Again, think this is a frontier settled by a few thousand people. A lot of them are related or know each other. So they start to march down. They're going to take on Ferguson. They eventually meet up with another group of backcountry militia. The two people I want to mention there, I've already mentioned John Sevier and Isaac Shelby, and William Campbell, who commands the Virginians in this story. Two other commanders worth mentioning right now are Benjamin Cleveland and Joseph Winston. Cleveland from Wilkes County and Winston from Surry County, though it's important to remember both of those counties are way bigger then than they are now. It's basically much of the northwest part of what is now North Carolina. Militia from those counties under command of Cleveland and Winston meet up with the Over-Mountain men and form a much larger army. Now you're getting almost to 1,000 men, many of them on horseback. They go down to what is now the Morganton area, Quaker Meadows, where they meet up with the McDowell brothers and yet another group of Patriot backcountry men. Now the army is well over 1,000.
Right.
Again, most with horses. They continue looking for Ferguson, trying to find him. Ferguson's dodging. They go actually into South Carolina to a place that was often called the cow pens. This is a place where you would let cows out to graze. And some South Carolina militia and even a few dozen from Georgia meet them there. So this is now a multi-province army looking for Ferguson. They leave, and they do get intelligence. Now, both armies, the Ferguson army of about 1,000 loyalists and provincials, and the Patriot army, which at this point probably totaled 1,600 men, they've got agents in the other's camp. So people defect from Sevier's companies and go to Ferguson and say, they're coming.
Right.
And a spy is in the Ferguson camp and leaves and goes, an old man, and he goes over to the Cowpens area and tells the Patriots, I know where they are. So the Patriots realize that Ferguson has decided to set up camp on a place called Kings Mountain. It's important, by the way, not to think this is some gigantic, movie-level, craggy mountain. Kings Mountain's really a hill.
Right. And it's not in the town of Kings Mountain.
It's not in the town of Kings Mountain.
It's about 7 miles south of the town of Kings Mountain.
Kings Mountain, North Carolina is the town. Kings Mountain, South Carolina is the battlefield.
Right.
And there are some larger mountains around, but Kings Mountain itself is sort of a plateau. It's about 60 feet high off of the nearby ground. So think about it. It's it's roughly the size of a football field at the top.
Right.
But it's much broader at the bottom. It's hundreds and hundreds of yards broader at the bottom. The top is sort of like a football field. It's kind of open. But the slopes are fairly steep going up to the top, and they're wooded. So a sensible person, knowing he might be outnumbered, knowing that he was pretty far away from the main army, Cornwallis's army in Charlotte, might not have decided to go up to the top of this football field and wait.
Yeah.
But for some reason, Ferguson decides to do this. Maybe because he thought the sides the slopes are steep, his men are stronger, he's going to win. And so he does make camp, and the Patriots decide, we can catch him. Now, I said there are maybe 1,500 men in the Patriot Army. They don't all come because they don't all have horses.
Right.
It's only about 900-ish or so actually can make the overnight ride through the rain to get to Kings Mountain.
Right, because it's North Carolina, South Carolina, late in the year. It's going to rain.
This is October 6th, the evening of October 6th. It's very rainy, and they do thunder their way. The horses drive through thunder through the night. They get to the hill. They surround the hill. So the two sides were probably roughly even in number at this point. But
maybe a few less on the Patriot side,
that's right.
but roughly even.
Roughly even. And the Patrick Ferguson and his loyalists think, well, we've got the high ground.
Well, I want to take a break right here, or not a break, but make a point. The loyalists probably feel they have the wind at their back right now. Charleston fell in May. The Battle of Camden, which was a pretty terrible defeat for the Patriots, happens in August. In September, Ferguson goes into the backcountry, starts his recruitment tour, and let's be honest, it was sort of a campaign of terror tour. He was threatening people.
He was.
Either if you fight against me, I threaten you, and if you don't fight for me, I threaten you. He was not he was not great at PR throughout this tour, and then Cornwallis, with the actual formal regular army, is getting ready to invade North Carolina. So much so that Josiah Martin, and for listeners of the podcast, he was the royal governor of North Carolina who vacated his post, dissolved the General Assembly, and then hightailed it down to what is now Southport, and then he spent a good bit of the war on the HMS Cruiser in the Cape Fear River before he went to New York for a while. He is back on the scene. And so we are on the eve of the battle on October 6th, but on October 3rd, Josiah Martin is in Charlotte redeclaring the opening of the royal government.
Yes.
This is back. We're back in business, baby.
Yep.
This is happening. And so we have these two militia groups. They're non-regular army militia groups, just some guys that got together. The only actual soldier of them all is Patrick Ferguson.
That's true.
Who is a British regular. He's a veteran. He was wounded at the Battle of Brandywine. He's from Scotland. He was born in 1744. If I can do that math, he's what, 30?
He's a young man.
36 at this point.
He's a young man. But many of the officers, the sort of mid-level officers, were fairly young.
Right, and so they meet October 6th. We're on the eve of the battle, so we're at October 6th of 1780. So take us into the battle.
Well, the battle is going to unfold on the 7th, as I recall.
It does.
And keep in mind again that, as you say, the militia on both sides, some of them have a fair amount of militia experience, but very few would have served like earlier in a regular unit. There were a few regulars under Patrick Ferguson, but they weren't all that experienced either, but they were at least regulars that had been trained. So the Americans are armed primarily with hunting and occasionally fowling weapons. In other words, rifles and occasionally a shotgun. Mostly rifles. Most of the loyalists and provincials that are on top of the King's Mountain are armed with muskets. Muskets fire more often, 3-ish times a minute, let's say, sometimes 4. But they're less accurate. The musket balls are much bigger, so if they hit you, you're going to do a lot of damage, but they're less accurate. But the important thing about the muskets is that they allow for a socket bayonet. So many times the way the British trained their troops, the way all armies were trained at that time, was fire your muskets once, maybe twice, then fix bayonets and charge.
Right.
This is what Patrick Ferguson's plan was. Fire, fix bayonets. In other words, in this case, there's no socket. You just stick it into the muzzle of the gun. You fix bayonets, and you charge. The Americans don't have that ability. They've got rifles, or maybe even little shotguns, but mostly rifles. And so they can shoot. They can shoot maybe once a minute. But if it close ranks, rifles are more fragile than muskets. They don't have pointy things on the ends.
Right.
And so you don't really want to get into a shoving match at this point, even with the loyalists on the other side with bayonets. So the American officers, William Campbell of Virginia is theoretically in charge, but actually Isaac Shelby is the primary driver of these events. And he basically tells the assorted men, you're sort of on your own. The officers will be with you, but fire when you can, fight when you can, and when we say run, run. So they go up the hill on all sides. If you think about King's Mountain as a kind of a long footprint, in the heel of the foot, we think, were Isaac Shelby and John Severe's companies of militia. At the toes of the foot were some other people we previously mentioned, Benjamin Cleveland, Joseph Winston, and somebody I haven't mentioned yet, Frederick Humbright, who was commander of some of what is today Lincoln and Gaston County militia. I mention him because he was one of these commanders, and also he was German. we sometimes think that these stories are all about people of English extraction, Scots-Irish extraction. Right. You have Cherokees, you have African Americans. Yes, but Germans were, as many as 30% of North Carolina's population were of German ancestry. Sure. Hambright was an example of someone born in a German state who was commanding patriots at Kings Mountain.
Particularly in the Backcountry, where there's a large Moravian population.
Moravians, but also the Lutherans and the German Reformed Church. Sure. All three of these groups. Moravians actually weren't. They were mostly pacifists, so they weren't involved in the fighting. But the Lutherans and the German Reform, the German Calvinists, they were absolutely a significant factor in the Backcountry. Even to this day, if you're driving around Piedmont or Western North Carolina, you will see Lutheran churches and what became the United Church of Christ and other churches that came out of the Calvinist tradition that were German speaking. So anyway, they all charge up the hill. They take cover behind these trees. Patrick Ferguson commands the Loyalists to shoot down at them. It's kind of hard to hit these guys coming up the hill at you. You're also shooting down. They had a tendency to overshoot the American. I shouldn't say Americans. They're all Americans.
Sure.
To overshoot the Patriots.
America's first Civil War.
That's right. The Patriots are taking some shots with their rifles.
Right.
They get up to the top, though, and this is when the bayonets get scary and the Americans come back down. So actually, if you were choreographing this dance, there were 3 waves, roughly. Up, say, go the Patriots. The Loyalists threaten them with bayonets or shoot at them. They go back down. Up the second time, go back down. The third time, though, they have worn out the Loyalists. At this point, the Patriots stay up. They go onto that sort of open plateau, and they start killing lots and lots of Loyalists.
I think so Ferguson is commanding the Loyalists at this point. And one important but small detail is, how is he commanding them at that point? And he famously has a silver whistle.
He does.
Which makes him very easy to spot.
And he has a very distinctive form of dress, a hunting shirt that's very, very colorful.
How does that work out for him, John?
He decides when after that third sweep up, when it's pretty obvious the Patriots are going to stay and they're going to have a final shoving match and shooting match, he decides to charge out with his officers. And as soon as he signals that charge and they start moving
with a whistle,
he gets shot multiple times, almost certainly instantly killed.
Yeah,
again, it was very
distinct. Where it says one of those was definitely through the heart.
Oh yes, but he got hit many times by rifle balls. And the story goes that after the battle was over, and it was over fairly quickly after he fell. At that point, the Loyalists started to throw up their hands. At first, there was an unwillingness by some of the Patriots to take prisoners because of the way the British and the Loyalists had treated Patriots before who would try to surrender. So there were probably some killings of people trying to surrender. But then the commanders did assert control. They took surrender. And at this point, the story goes, some Patriots took Patrick Ferguson's body and pulled their trousers down and did some things to deface his body because, of course, he had said that they were going to pee on people, so they decided to prove him right.
Right.
So anyway,
as one does,
and so they took most of what happened here was not a massacre; it was the taking of prisoners. I think maybe 700 or even more, maybe 800 of the Loyalist forces were captured, not killed. The Americans suffered fewer than 100 casualties in this battle. It was an overwhelming victory for the Patriot cause, had lots of implications that we can talk about in a moment. There were some controversial things that happened. There was a brief period of time when the commanders lost control and there were some executions of British prisoners or Loyalist prisoners. Most of those prisoners were paroled eventually, like we talked about before. They didn't have POW camps and do all that. They just said, you have to swear that you're not going to take up arms against the Patriot cause.
Well, and the two armies were just guys who decided to join up together.
And keep in mind that, this is kind of a cliche, but it is true. All through the 1780s, into the early 1781s, and definitely even in and around Kings Mountain, some of the Loyalists and the Patriots knew each other. Some of them were relatives. Some of them felt very bad about being on this other side, but some of them hated each other with a passion.
Sure.
So some of this was a Patriot did something to my cousin who was a Patriot, so I'm going to do something to his cousin who's a Loyalist, and this goes on and on and on. So some of this was almost like blood feuds.
Hatfields and McCoys.
It was very much like that. And a lot of these militia on both sides were Scotch-Irish extraction, kind of border people, kind of rough. think it's fair to say. And even some of the English, Benjamin Cleveland, for example, was not Scotch-Irish. He was of English extraction. His family was from Yorkshire, from the border.
Yeah.
The Northern English and the Southern Scots, it's very hard to tell the difference between the two. So a lot of so-called Scots-Irish were really people from Northern England. But anyway, it was a very rough period. Then the commanders all go home. I mentioned earlier that the over mountain men had a decision to make. If we leave our homes and go over the mountain and fight with our cousins and defeat Patrick Ferguson, those Cherokee might attack our settlements along the Watauga.
Still at large.
Absolutely. And in fact, along the Nolichucky and the Watauga River and some other, there were in fact Indian raids during this period. Mm-hmm. And when Isaac Shelby and John Sevier get back, they have some work to do.
Wow.
So this is a fascinating story. It's a genuine turning point in the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War, because Cornwallis has lost his left flank. Mm-hmm. He has to pull back into South Carolina for a while. He will eventually move back into North Carolina, but weaker than he would have been if he had had a good, nice left flank. And in fact, the other flanking group, Bannister Tarleton's forces will be defeated a few months later at Cowpens.
Back at Cowpens.
Absolutely. And so he loses a lot of his supportive troops. He does proceed into North Carolina, and I know you're going to tell the rest of that story of Cornwallis in North Carolina and Cornwallis ultimately having to go to the coast. But this was an important moment where it was very clear that there wasn't going to be a loyalist uprising that was going to save Cornwallis's bacon. It was going to be the other way around. There was a patriot uprising that cooked his bacon.
Well done. Well played on that. I grew up in Tennessee and took Tennessee history as a seventh grader. Mm-hmm. And then I moved to Georgia when I was a teenager, and I took the history of Georgia in college. And then I took the history of North Carolina when I was in college here because I took the scenic route through college. But from a Tennessee perspective, it's taught in schools that these over mountain men from Tennessee came to North Carolina, and they were the real heroes in this turning point in the Revolutionary War. Right. And of course, we were talking about, they were all North Carolinians.
They were, and about half of the forces at Kings Mountain on the Patriot side were really more than half were backcountry people. They weren't from over the mountain. So the over mountain men were absolutely essential. And as I said, three of the key commanders, particularly Isaac Shelby, were over mountain people, but they were over mountain. They were from North Carolina, their minds.
Right. Oh, they would have told you they were from North Carolina. Sure. But I want to take a little bit of time now. Let's talk about at least three of these leaders. I want to talk about Isaac Shelby, John Sevier, or Sevier, however you want to say it.
Sevier.
It's Sevier. If you go to Sevier County, Tennessee, they'll say it's Sevier. And then Benjamin Cleveland, who I will argue, and I think our listeners will understand why, it was probably the more terrifying of the three, but
absolutely.
But probably the least organized
He was a very effective militia commander. Mm-hmm. He wanted to command the forces at Kings Mountain, but he was not popular enough to get the vote. This was a democratic process. Mm-hmm. The various colonels of the various militia companies, the companies were commanded by captains, then there were majors, there were lieutenant colonels and colonels. The colonels decided to go with William Campbell. He wasn't from North Carolina, so he wasn't like part of any faction.
Oh, I see. So a neutral party.
This was a kind of perceived as a neutral party. But as I said earlier, I think this is accurate, even though Isaac Shelby is my relative. I think I'm being honest here. Shelby was the primary driver of these. He came up with the strategy. He was the primary orator that got everybody excited. Mm-hmm. He was the one that made the key strategic decisions and mostly made them well. After the war, he did a lot of surveying. He had served in the Virginia legislature. Mm-hmm. When he thought he lived in Virginia, it turns out he lived in North Carolina. So then he was elected to North Carolina State Senate. Mm-hmm. Later on, he moves to Kentucky. He becomes the first governor of Kentucky. That's Isaac Shelby. John Sevier becomes one of the first governors of Tennessee.
He is the first governor of Tennessee.
Yeah. And he was briefly involved in the state of Franklin controversy, which we won't get into. He was, in fact, technically I think he was the governor.
He was.
But he wasn't really into the Franklin cause the way a lot of other people were, but he did become the first governor of Tennessee. And another person that I'm not sure I mentioned yet. Did I mention Andrew Jackson yet?
No, we've not talked about the young man from Salisbury.
We should mention very quickly, he was born on the North Carolina-South Carolina line. I mentioned William Richardson Davie, who was one of the militia commanders in the Charlotte area. Mm-hmm. One of his young, I think 15, 16-year-old spies that was working for him was a young man named Andrew Jackson. He was captured by the British The British officer is interrogating him and cuts him with a sword. And from that day until the end of his days, Andrew Jackson detested the British.
Oh, absolutely.
He did, in fact, eventually become a lawyer in Salisbury. He lived with Andrew Jackson's also my first cousin.
Okay.
And he lived with one of my ancestors for a while during the 1780 period, hid out with my ancestor who was a minister. Eventually becomes a lawyer in Salisbury. Then he goes, like so many North Carolinians, go to Tennessee to make his fortune. We know who Andrew Jackson becomes. But interestingly, Jackson and Sevier hated each other too. Andrew Jackson had a talent for getting for feuds.
He did. He was very talented at that. It's interesting reading histories of Andrew Jackson because all the people he's born in in Union County, I think.
Well, it's unclear whether he was born in North and South Carolina. I think he was born in North Carolina. It doesn't really matter. He was born in the Waxhaws, which is on the border.
Right, and then he ends up as a young man practicing law in Salisbury.
Yes,
but apparently, like a lot of the older people, when he goes on to become a politico in Tennessee and goes on to be president, a lot of the older people in Salisbury were just young Andy.
Yeah.
He's running for president?
Yeah.
Like that's sort of the comments that people
Sevier
were getting.
actually was one of the people with whom Andrew Jackson had a duel. They actually shot at each other.
Interesting.
Well, the third person you mentioned, Benjamin Cleveland.
From Wilkes County. And for folks around Wilkes County or who've gone through Wilkes County, he had a large estate in Wilkes County called Roundabout, and people would refer to him as Old Roundabout.
He was a rather heavy-set fellow.
But it's in Rhonda, which I think that's where we went from Roundabout to Rhonda, right? But that's, if you want to know where he was from, he's from that area.
He was a talented, as I said, a talented commander of militia companies. He was really notorious and merciless with regard to Tories. There are many stories about Benjamin Cleveland. One of the ones that I think is the most telling about it, the way he approached this problem, they captured a couple of Tories that they accused at least of doing more than just being Tories, but being horse thieves or breaking into people's houses, which did happen a lot. And so they hung one of the Tories almost immediately in a pretty gruesome way. And then they made the other Tory watch. And then Benjamin Cleveland turns to the other Tory and he says, all right, you can either get the same thing this guy got, or you can cut off both of your ears and leave the province and never come back. Wisely, but painfully, the other Tory took a knife, actually took the trouble to sharpen it so it wouldn't hurt quite as much, chopped off both of his ears and ran off. This was what Benjamin Cleveland was like. After the war, he actually lost his property in North Carolina, and he ended up living in South Carolina. He became a judge. He was about 6 feet tall, and he was very big and muscular as a youth. He was kind of burly as a young man. He became portly as a middle-aged man, and by the time he was a judge in South Carolina, he was flat out obese, maybe 400 pounds or larger.
Very tall man as well.
About 6 feet tall.
Yeah, for the time. That's...
Not quite 6 feet wide, but close enough. And so he would fall asleep. It appears during some of the court proceedings, and some of the local potentates in that part of South Carolina, they liked him. They wanted to stay in his good graces, but they were sometimes reticent to invite him to stay the night, because they thought that he might break the bed frames in their guest bedrooms. But he had like so many, he had a reputation that was largely deserved, but then exaggerated later. And it's worth saying about a lot of these people. John Sevier, who had a famous romance with a young lady named Catherine or Kate, Bonnie Kate. So if you go to parts of Northeast Tennessee, you will find Bonnie Kate this and Bonnie Kate that. John Sevier and his Bonnie Kate is kind of a legend in the frontier. Isaac Shelby was a bit of a legend. His friend Daniel Boone, who's not involved in these events, but they were friends, has his own legend. And the Battle of Kings Mountain itself becomes a legend.
Right.
I told you that maybe 900 or 1,000 men were actually involved in charging up the hill to the plateau, but many, many more Americans claim to have been there, perhaps in part because you could get a small pension if you could prove that you were there.
I see.
So the pension applications took a very long time for people to sort out exactly who was telling the truth, but for generations after, this was very much like if you're, from Scotland, you have various legends about Culloden and, Falkirk and all these places. Wherever you're from, you have these legendary stories. Kings Mountain became a legendary story where people would tell their grandchildren, tell their nephews, tell their nieces about the time they were at Kings Mountain. And maybe they did march there like 2 or 3 days after because they didn't have a good horse. And so they were in the army. They were in Benjamin Cleveland's units from Wilkes County, but they didn't actually participate in the battle. So there's a lot of that folklore that develops, the frontier folklore. And in fact, there was another fellow who wasn't very prominent. He was in, I think, Isaac Shelby's forces, named John Crockett. And his son, Davy Crockett, becomes another one of these frontier heroes who used to tell stories about his great big father, John, at the Battle of Kings Mountain.
Oh, okay.
So a lot of this, what we consider to be the Western lore of the early 19th century, later becomes the Wild West, but at this point it's more of a Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett kind of a story. A lot of that early on is associated with the Battle of Kings Mountain.
That's very interesting. I didn't realize that John Crockett was there, and Davy Crockett looms large in the history of Tennessee.
Of course.
Obviously.
Looms large in the history of America.
He does. And if you go to Crockett County, Tennessee now, its county seat is Alamo, which is a fun a little bit of trivia. John Sevier, we didn't talk about him in our last episode, but he was actually at the 5th Provincial Congress representing the Watauga District, which was a semi-autonomous district, and that's a more complicated conversation. But he was there and voted on the first state constitution.
And we hear Watauga in North Carolina, we think Watauga County, county seat Boone.
Right.
But actually, in that case, we are talking about the over-the-mountain area that is now Sullivan County, Tennessee, Washington County, Tennessee. It's that northeast part of Tennessee that it was then North Carolina.
And if you've ever been to Pigeon Forge, you are in Sevier County, Tennessee. That's his namesake, and he's got a lot in the history of that state as well. Benjamin Cleveland, great after-war history there. He the tree that he used to hang that Tory was used on a few other people. They think, I've read accounts that he hung as many as 5 Tories from what became known as the Tory tree, which I think the tree itself is not there in Wilkesboro anymore. It used to be sort of a staple that people would look at beside the old courthouse there in Wilkesboro, but I think the stump is still there, or at least they have a plaque there showing where it had been.
And if you go all around Western North Carolina, you will find historic markers and sites referring to the various stops along the over mountain trail. As those troops, as I said, are coming over the mountains. They're meeting up with some troops. They're going further south. They're meeting up with some other troops in Morgan County. Morganton. They go further south. They're meeting up with troops in upstate South Carolina. So this is, and in fact, there's a reenactment. I think almost every year of the Over Mountain March.
Oh, really? Mm-hmm. Oh, that's fascinating. I didn't know that. Well, you've been to the Kings Mountain battlefield.
I have.
If people went there to visit today, what would they find?
Well, you will see that it is not some dramatic set from some mountain movie or something. That's not what it looks like. You will see lots of historical markers. You will see that as you walk around the plateau, you see that it's quite a large area around. Mm-hmm. But when you get to the top, you will see that it is not. I think it was maybe 120 yards, 130, something like that long.
I see.
And not quite as maybe 50 yards wide. So it's not a gigantic space at the top, but much of the battle was happening on those slopes. They're not like straight up slopes like you have to climb a cliff.
Right.
But they weren't
rappelling up and down.
They weren't rappelling, but it did take some energy to go up, thread through the trees that were on the slopes and get up to the top. Knowing that there were enemies there that were shooting musket balls down at you and then we're going to fix bayonets and charge. It did take a lot of courage. They didn't overwhelm in terms of numbers. As we said, the two armies were not that much different in size. Sure. But the difference was the Patriots had a clear sense of what they were fighting for. They had very motivated officers, in part because of the behavior of Patrick Ferguson. And Patrick Ferguson had gotten himself surrounded, which is never a great idea.
Right. No, it's not. Well, John, any words you'd like to leave us with on sort of the legacy of Kings Mountain as we sign off here?
Well, it's important for North Carolinians and for any Americans to understand the extent to which the Southern campaign that started, as we mentioned earlier, in 1778 with the taking of Savannah in late 78 and extends all the way to Yorktown, which again is a Southern battle, that's when the Revolutionary War was actually clinched and won. Yeah. The Americans did an excellent job of not being knocked out and of hanging around long enough for the French to come in. That was essential. All of that is true. But the British probably would have kept fighting if they had enjoyed more success in the southern colonies and been able to control those valuable southern crops, and they've been able to not worry about that part of the American colonies and focus on defeating the French in the Caribbean, defeating the French up north, defeating the French at Gibraltar. This became a world war. They started fighting in a lot of other parts of the world. And so the North Carolinians and the South Carolinians and the Virginians and the Georgians that won that Battle of Kings Mountain made a seminal contribution, not just to the founding of America, but to the altering of the history of the world.
Yeah. No, I think that's very well put. Thank you for joining us today. For listeners of the podcast, thank you for listening in as well. Again, please like and subscribe, share with your friends, and have everybody start with episode 1 as we walk through, I think, a fascinating history of the Old North State in America's Revolution. It's something that North Carolinians can celebrate, and it's also just interesting history if you're a history buff. But join us next time as we start to get into Cornwallis's invasion of North Carolina as we get into 1781 and we near the end of the military conflict. We'll see you next time.